Accused, targeted, and under fire, Barron Trump faces the unthinkable at sea. But how he handled it stunned everyone. The Elysian Voyager was a floating palace, its gleaming white hull cutting effortlessly through the calm waters of the Pacific. This wasn't just a cruise. It was an experience designed for those seeking unparalleled luxury, far from the chaos of everyday life. For Barron Trump, it was exactly what he needed. Standing on the upper deck, he leaned against the polished railing, the salty breeze tousling his hair. At just over 6 feet tall, with a quiet, composed demeanor, he had grown into a man who preferred observation to spectacle. The distant horizon glowed with shades of orange and pink, the setting sun painting a masterpiece that not even the finest galleries could rival. Beside him stood Isabel, her auburn hair catching the light like fire. She wasn't a face the tabloids would recognize, and that was intentional. Isabel was smart, grounded, and fiercely private, a rare combination in Barron's world. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, glancing over at him with a playful smile. "You're thinking too much," she teased, nudging his arm gently. Barron smirked, turning his gaze toward her. "Just enjoying the moment." "You're trying to enjoy it," she corrected, her tone warm but knowing. "Big difference." He laughed softly, the sound carried away by the wind. She wasn't wrong. Even on this luxurious escape, he couldn't completely switch off. Years of public scrutiny had trained him to remain guarded, always aware of how one photo or overheard comment could spiral into weeks of headlines. The cruise had been Isabel's idea, a chance for them to step away from the spotlight and simply be themselves. For the first 2 days, it worked. They wandered the ship like ordinary passengers, savoring exquisite meals, lounging by the pool, and marveling at the seemingly endless ocean. At night, they strolled under a canopy of stars, finding solace in the kind of quiet moments their usual lives rarely afforded. But not everyone aboard the Elysian Voyager seemed as enchanted by their presence. Barron had noticed Captain Hargrove on several occasions, always watching, his sharp blue eyes lingering a moment too long. Hargrove was a commanding figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of grizzled authority that demanded respect. His uniform was immaculate, his stride purposeful, but his gaze carried something unsettling. "Have you noticed him staring?" Barron asked Isabel one afternoon as they lounged on the sun deck. "Who?" she asked, looking up from her book. "The captain," Barron said, nodding subtly toward the man standing near the bridge. Isabel followed his gaze. Hargrove was speaking to a crew member but glanced their way just as she looked. His expression was unreadable, but his attention lingered a beat too long before returning to his conversation. "He's probably just curious," Isabel said, trying to brush it off. "You're not exactly anonymous." Barron frowned but said nothing. He had grown used to people staring, but this felt different, like he wasn't just being watched, but evaluated. Later that evening, as they dined in the opulent garden bistro, Barron couldn't shake the feeling of being under scrutiny. The captain made a brief appearance, moving through the dining area to greet guests. When he reached their table, he paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Enjoying your voyage, Mr. Trump?" Hargrove asked, his tone polite but clipped. "Yes, thank you," Barron replied, his voice measured. Hargrove's gaze flicked to Isabel, then back to Barron. "Good. Let me know if there's anything I can do to make your stay more memorable." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Isabel gave Barron a questioning look, but he simply shrugged, determined not to let the encounter ruin their evening. For a while, it seemed like nothing more than an odd moment, a quirk of a man used to running a tight ship. But deep down, Barron couldn't ignore the unease it stirred. The Elysian Voyager might have promised a sanctuary away from the public eye, but something about this journey felt different. And soon, they'd realize just how quickly a picture-perfect escape could take a dark and unexpected turn. But when that tranquility shattered, no one could have foreseen the storm that was about to engulf them all. The morning sunlight spilled across the Elysian Voyager as it glided across the open sea, the gentle sway of the ship barely noticeable. Passengers moved through the decks with a carefree air, sipping their morning coffees or settling into deck chairs for a day of indulgent relaxation. Barron and Isabel stepped onto the promenade, their faces warmed by the sun and their spirits lifted by the vibrant atmosphere of the ship. Breakfast at the Garden Bistro had become their favorite routine. Situated on the upper deck with panoramic views of the ocean, the bistro offered a sense of peaceful detachment from the world. Tables were adorned with crisp white linens, and the soft clinking of silverware mingled with the sound of waves lapping against the hull. Isabel took a sip of freshly squeezed orange juice, her gaze drifting across the tables. Families laughed over stacks of pancakes, an older gentleman read a thick paperback, and waiters moved gracefully between the guests. It was the kind of scene you'd see in a travel brochure. Perfectly serene. "You're smiling," Isabel teased, leaning forward with a playful smirk. Barron looked up from his plate, his lips curling into a small grin. "Am I not allowed to?" "It's just rare," she replied, her tone light but affectionate. "Nice, though. You seem happy." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling as he let the moment wash over him. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "At least here, I'm not that guy from the headlines. Just me." "See? I told you this trip would be good for you," Isabel said with a wink, popping a strawberry into her mouth. Across the deck, a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing through the air. Barron watched them with a faint smile, reminded of simpler times before his name became synonymous with controversy and scrutiny. But even as he soaked in the tranquility, a flicker of unease lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just Captain Hargrove's behavior that unsettled him. It was how out of place it felt amid the ship's polished elegance. Hargrove had passed their table earlier, acknowledging them with a curt nod, but his eyes lingered on Barron just a second too long. It was as if the captain were assessing him, trying to unravel something unseen. "Do you think he's always like that?" Barron asked suddenly. "Who?" Isabel replied, setting down her glass. "The captain," Barron said, glancing subtly toward the bridge, where Hargrove stood talking to a crew member. Isabel followed his gaze. "He's probably just old school. You know, the kind of guy who's all about order and respect." "Maybe," Barron muttered, though he wasn't entirely convinced. As the day unfolded, the ship buzzed with activity. The pool deck was alive with splashes and shouts as kids dove into the water, while adults lounged with frozen drinks in hand. A live jazz band played soft tunes near the bar, creating a soundtrack of leisure that seemed to melt away the worries of the passengers. Barron and Isabel wandered the decks, stopping to browse the ship's boutique shops and admire the sprawling ocean views. Isabel found a delicate bracelet in a jewelry store, and Barron surprised her by purchasing it before she could protest. "Stop spoiling me," she chided, though her smile betrayed her delight. "It's not spoiling if you deserve it," he replied with a smirk. As evening approached, the anticipation for the ship's formal gala grew. Guests returned to their cabins to change into their finest attire, eager for a night of glamour. Barron and Isabel joined in, taking their time to get ready. He chose a tailored navy suit while she wore a flowing emerald gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a classic Hollywood film. The grand ballroom was a sight to behold, its high ceilings adorned with ornate chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow. A string quartet played softly in the corner as elegantly dressed guests sipped champagne and mingled. Barron and Isabel entered arm in arm, their presence drawing subtle but noticeable attention from the crowd. "You're turning heads," Isabel whispered as they made their way to the dance floor. "So are you?" Barron replied, spinning her gently as they moved to the rhythm of the music. For a while, the weight of the outside world seemed to vanish. They laughed, they danced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Barron allowed himself to fully embrace the moment. But not everyone shared their joy. From a balcony above, Captain Hargrove watched in silence, his sharp features shadowed by the dim light. His hand rested on the railing, his fingers drumming in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His gaze was locked on Barron, his expression unreadable but tense. A steward approached the captain, offering him a glass of champagne. Hargrove waved it away, his focus never wavering. "They always think they're untouchable," he muttered under his breath, his words drowned out by the music below. Back on the dance floor, Barron and Isabel shared a quiet moment as the music softened. He looked into her eyes, his hand resting gently on her waist. "This is perfect," Isabel said softly. "It is," Barron agreed, though the lingering presence of Hargrove in his peripheral vision left a faint chill in his otherwise perfect evening. But as the night grew older, the cracks in the ship's peaceful facade were about to widen, and no one could foresee the chaos that was brewing just below the surface. The grand ballroom of the Elysian Voyager was the epitome of elegance, its towering ceilings adorned with cascading crystal chandeliers. Every detail, from the polished marble floors to the gold-accented columns, reflected an opulence that made the passengers feel as though they'd stepped into another era. Soft strains of classical music played in the background as guests mingled, their laughter mingling with the gentle clinking of glasses. Barron and Isabel stood near the dance floor, chatting with a couple they'd met earlier in the day. Isabel's emerald dress shimmered under the golden light, catching admiring glances from more than a few of the attendees. Barron, ever the gentleman, wore his usual composed demeanor, his polite smiles and reserved conversation putting those around him at ease. As they spoke, the massive doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a force that silenced the room. The music stopped mid-note, and the collective hum of conversation dissipated, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. All eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. Captain Hargrove stood in the doorway, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the polished floor. His hat was missing, his usually pristine uniform slightly askew, and his face was flushed, either from anger or alcohol, or both. In his right hand, he held a half-empty glass of whiskey, the liquid sloshing as he stepped forward. "There he is," Hargrove bellowed, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. His eyes locked on Barron, who instinctively straightened, his calm demeanor masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. The captain's words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "The golden boy, hiding out here like he's just one of us," Hargrove continued, his tone dripping with disdain. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of a table. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the crowd as Hargrove's words sank in. Barron felt Isabel's hand tighten around his arm, her tension radiating through her grip. "What is he doing?" Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. Barron didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the captain, studying him carefully. This wasn't the calculated disdain of a man merely enforcing his authority. This was personal. Hargrove began moving toward them, his steps heavy and unsteady. "You think you can just walk in here, waltzing around like you own the place?" he spat. His voice grew louder with each step, his words slurring slightly. "You don't belong here. Not you. Not your kind." The room fell utterly silent, the weight of his words sinking in. A few passengers gasped, while others glanced at Barron, unsure of what to expect. "Captain," Barron said evenly, his voice calm but firm, "you've had a lot to drink. This isn't the time or place." "Oh, it's the perfect time," Hargrove shot back, slamming his glass down on a nearby table with a loud clatter. "You think I don't know who you are? I know exactly who you are. I've spent years watching people like you, entitled, arrogant, taking whatever you want without a second thought for the rest of us." Barron didn't flinch, though his chest tightened. He had faced public confrontations before, but this was different. This wasn't a reporter ambushing him with a question or a stranger snapping photos. This was raw, unfiltered hostility. "Look, I don't know what you think I've done," Barron said, his tone steady but laced with quiet authority. "But I'm not going to stand here and let you insult me or the people in this room." Hargrove laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "Oh, the prince speaks. How noble." He took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near growl. "You don't belong here, and I'm not the only one who knows it." Isabel tugged at Barron's arm, her voice urgent. "Let's just leave. This isn't worth it." But Barron didn't move. He met Hargrove's glare head-on, his expression calm but unyielding. "Captain, I'm going to ask you to step back and take some time to cool off. Whatever this is, we can talk about it privately." "Privately?" Hargrove barked, his voice rising again. No more secrets. People need to know the truth about you and your family. They need to see what you really are. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, tension rippling through the room like an electric current. A crew member standing near the entrance took a tentative step forward, his face pale. "Captain, maybe it's best if we step outside," he said cautiously, but Hargrove waved him off. "Don't tell me how to run my ship," he snapped, his attention still locked on Barron. "This isn't over, kid. Not by a long shot." Before the situation could escalate further, two senior officers approached the captain, their movements deliberate but non-confrontational. "Sir, we need to speak with you," one of them said quietly, placing a firm hand on Hargrove's shoulder. For a moment it seemed as though Hargrove might resist, but then he pulled away with a frustrated grunt, allowing the officers to guide him toward the exit. He cast one last glance at Barron, his eyes burning with resentment. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath before disappearing into the hallway. The ballroom remained silent for several beats, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. Slowly the music resumed, but the festive atmosphere was gone. Conversations were hushed, the guests exchanging uneasy glances as they tried to process the scene. Barron exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to Isabel. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her expression was still tense. "What was that?" "I don't know," Barron admitted. "But something tells me this isn't over." But as the ballroom settled back into an uneasy calm, the real storm was only just beginning to brew. The ballroom was still abuzz with whispers long after Captain Hargrove was escorted out. Guests clutched their glasses a little tighter, their polished small talk replaced by murmured speculation. The elegant atmosphere had been pierced, leaving a sense of unease that even the gentle strains of music couldn't mask. Barron and Isabel stood near the entrance, watching as the night limped back into its rhythm. "We should go," Isabel said softly, her voice tinged with worry. Barron nodded, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as he guided her toward the exit. Heads turned as they passed, whispers following them like a shadow. Isabel's grip on his arm tightened, but Barron kept his expression calm and composed, even as his mind raced. The corridors outside the ballroom were quieter, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound accompanying their footsteps. Isabel let out a shaky breath, her voice low but urgent. "Barron, what just happened? Why would he come after you like that?" "I don't know," Barron replied, his voice steady but his jaw tense. It felt personal, though. He wasn't just venting, he's holding on to something. Isabel frowned. "Maybe he's just unstable. Or drunk. Either way, this doesn't feel safe." Barron glanced around the empty hallway, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. "It's more than that. Did you hear what he said? About my family? This isn't random." Isabel hesitated, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you think he believes one of those conspiracy theories? The ones they spread online about your family?" "It wouldn't be the first time," Barron said bitterly. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. But this felt different. He seemed certain, like he has some kind of personal grudge. As they reached their suite, Barron swiped his keycard and pushed the door open, holding it for Isabel. Once inside, the familiar luxury of their cabin did little to ease the tension hanging in the air. Isabel perched on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Barron leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he considered his options. "If I report him, this whole thing becomes a headline. Barron Trump confronts unhinged captain. It'll spiral out of control and no one will care about what really happened." Isabel tilted her head, studying him. "So you're just going to do nothing?" "No," Barron said firmly. "But I need to figure out what he's holding on to. If this is about me or my family, I can't just ignore it." She stood, closing the distance between them. "You're not going to confront him, are you? That man is dangerous, Barron. You saw how he acted tonight." "I'm not going to do anything reckless," Barron assured her. But if he comes at me again, I'm going to handle it. I'm not going to let him keep this ship in chaos just because he has a chip on his shoulder." Isabel sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I just don't want you to get hurt. This was supposed to be our escape, remember?" Barron placed a hand on her cheek, his expression softening. "I know. And I'm not going to let him ruin it for us. Whatever this is, I'll make sure it doesn't go any further." The night stretched on, but Barron found no rest. Long after Isabel had fallen asleep, he lay awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Hargrove's words replayed in his mind, each accusation cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent his entire life under the weight of his family's name, bearing the brunt of both admiration and animosity. But this was different. Hargrove's anger wasn't fueled by idle gossip or baseless rumors. It carried a sharp, deliberate edge that hinted at something deeper. By the time dawn broke, Barron had made up his mind. He couldn't wait for Hargrove to make the next move. Whatever the captain's motivations, Barron needed answers before the situation spiraled any further. The first opportunity came later that morning during a meeting with the ship's head of security. After the events of the previous night, the crew had decided to keep a closer eye on Hargrove, whose behavior had raised red flags among even his most loyal officers. "We've reviewed some of the security footage from last night," the officer explained, his tone measured. "It's concerning. There's evidence that Captain Hargrove's actions weren't entirely impulsive." Barron leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated, glancing at Isabel before continuing. "He was watching you throughout the day, on the promenade, at the Garden Bistro, even during the gala. And before he entered the ballroom, he spent time in his quarters, pacing, muttering to himself. He was clearly agitated." "Agitated about what?" Isabel asked, her voice tight. "We're still looking into it," the officer admitted. "But there's something else. He's been corresponding with someone, a journalist. We haven't seen the full extent of their communication yet, but it seems like he's been planning to leak information about your family." Barron's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. "So this wasn't just a drunken outburst. He was targeting me." The officer nodded. "That's how it appears. And based on his behavior, we're recommending that you avoid further contact with him for the remainder of the voyage." But Barron shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No. If he's holding on to something, I need to know what it is. I'll talk to him myself." Isabel's eyes widened. "Barron, you can't be serious." "After last night, I'm not afraid of him," Barron said firmly. "If he has something to say, I want to hear it. And I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be intimidated." The officer hesitated but eventually nodded. "If you're sure about this, I'll arrange for you to meet him in a controlled environment. But I strongly advise caution." Barron nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll handle it." But as the meeting loomed closer, Barron couldn't shake the feeling that confronting Hargrove would only be the beginning of a much larger battle. The morning after the confrontation in the ballroom, the atmosphere aboard the Elysian Voyager was different. The once lively energy that had filled the ship was subdued, replaced by a strange mix of curiosity and tension. Passengers huddled in small groups on the sundeck, their whispers carrying fragments of last night's chaos. "I heard the captain completely lost it," one woman said, her voice hushed but animated. "Wasn't he yelling at that Trump kid? Can you imagine?" her companion replied, shaking her head. Barron and Isabel kept a low profile, opting to have breakfast on the quieter side of the promenade deck. The usual hum of conversation in the Garden Bistro felt sharper, more pointed. Every so often a guest would glance in their direction, quickly looking away when Barron caught their eye. Isabel shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her coffee untouched. "They're all talking about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let them," Barron replied calmly, though his grip on his fork betrayed his frustration. Isabel leaned in, lowering her voice even further. "Some of the crew are saying this isn't the first time Hargrove has acted like this. Apparently he's had issues before, especially with passengers he sees as privileged." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Issues like what?" Someone mentioned he had a falling out with the senator's family a few years ago on another voyage. Rumor is he has a thing against people in power, Isabel said, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. Barron sighed, leaning back in his chair. So this isn't just about me. It's about what I represent to him. Before Isabel could respond, a steward approached their table, his demeanor nervous. Mr. Trump, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Captain Hargrove has requested a private meeting with you in his quarters this afternoon. Isabel's eyes widened, her hand tightening on Barron's arm. Absolutely not, she said quickly, looking at the steward. The steward hesitated, clearly caught in an awkward position. I understand your hesitation, ma'am, but the captain insisted. Barron frowned, his mind racing. A meeting with Hargrove felt like walking into the lion's den, but at the same time it could be an opportunity to get answers. He glanced at Isabel, whose expression was a mix of worry and disbelief. I'll meet him, Barron said finally, his voice steady. Barron, no, Isabel protested. You can't. I'll be fine, he assured her. Turning to the steward, he added, Tell him I'll be there. The hours leading up to the meeting passed slowly. Isabel paced the room, clearly on edge, while Barron sat by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. His thoughts were a jumble of questions. What was Hargrove's endgame? Why had he chosen this moment on this trip to lash out? When the time came, Barron made his way to the captain's quarters, flanked by 2 senior crew members who had insisted on accompanying him. The narrow corridor leading to Hargrove's office felt colder, more oppressive, the hum of the ship's engines reverberating faintly through the walls. You don't have to do this, one of the crew members said quietly as they reached the door. Yes, I do, Barron replied, his tone resolute. The crew members exchanged uneasy glances but stepped back, allowing Barron to enter alone. The door creaked open, revealing Hargrove seated behind a large oak desk. His uniform was neatly pressed, but his face bore the signs of sleeplessness. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, tracked Barron as he stepped inside. You're brave, I'll give you that, Hargrove muttered, gesturing to the chair across from him. Barron sat, his posture straight, his expression calm. You wanted to see me. I'm here. Say what you need to say. For a moment, Hargrove simply stared at him, as if searching for something. Then he leaned back in his chair, letting out a bitter laugh. You have no idea what it's like, do you? To spend your entire life working, sacrificing, only to watch people like you coast by on a name. Barron frowned. If this is about my family, it's always about your family, Hargrove snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. Do you know how many lives were ruined because of them? Do you know what it's like to lose everything because someone with power decided you didn't matter? What are you talking about? Barron asked, his voice calm but firm. If you have something to say, then say it. What did my family do to you? Hargrove's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. It's not just me, he said, his voice low. It's everyone who's been crushed under the weight of people like you. You think you're untouchable, that your name gives you the right to walk all over the rest of us. Well, not on my ship. Before Barron could respond, the intercom in the room crackled to life. Captain, we need you on the bridge immediately, a voice said, its tone urgent. Hargrove hesitated, his anger momentarily giving way to frustration. This isn't over, he muttered, rising from his chair. Barron stood as well, his gaze steady. No, it's not. But this is the wrong way to handle it, Captain. Whatever you think you're proving, it's not going to work. Hargrove glared at him but said nothing as he stormed out of the room, leaving Barron alone. As Barron stepped back into the hallway, the senior crew members waiting outside looked at him expectantly. What happened? One of them asked. He's angry, Barron said simply. But this isn't just about me. He's holding on to something bigger, something personal. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that Hargrove's vendetta was only the surface of a deeper, more dangerous storm brewing aboard the ship. The tension aboard the Elysian Voyager had shifted from whispers to outright speculation. By midday, it was clear that the events of the previous night had become the talk of the ship, Passengers lingered in common areas, their conversations punctuated by quick glances toward the bridge or murmured theories about what the captain might do next. Barron and Isabel were escorted to the ship's security office by two senior officers. The crew had been on high alert since the ballroom incident, and new developments hinted that the situation was far more complex than anyone initially believed. Inside the small, sterile room, a row of monitors displayed live footage from security cameras stationed throughout the ship. The head of security, a stoic man named Officer Perez, stood by the console, his face grim. He motioned for Barron and Isabel to sit, his tone calm but serious. "We've uncovered additional information about Captain Hargrove's behavior," Perez began. "It appears he's been tracking your movements since the day you boarded. His actions last night weren't impulsive. They were calculated." Perez clicked a few buttons on the console, and one of the monitors lit up with footage from the ballroom. Barron and Isabel watched as the events of the previous night played out on the screen. The captain's erratic entrance, his heated confrontation with Barron, and the eventual intervention by the crew. But then Perez rewound the footage, stopping at a frame that showed Hargrove in a hallway just outside the ballroom. He was pacing, his hands gesturing wildly as if arguing with someone. In his hand was a phone, and as the footage zoomed in, it became clear he was looking at an article on the screen. "What's he reading?" Isabel asked, leaning forward. Perez enhanced the image. The text was blurry but legible enough to make out a headline. "Trump family allegations resurface. Maritime disaster sparks new questions." Barron frowned, his jaw tightening. "That's from last week. It's a hit piece tying my family to a shipping company that cut corners years ago. They claimed it led to a major accident, but it was never proven." Perez nodded. "It seems the captain took it personally. Based on our findings, his brother was involved in that disaster, one of the victims. Hargrove may have connected your family to his loss, whether it's true or not." Isabel's face paled as she processed the information. "So this isn't just resentment, it's grief. And he's blaming you for it." Barron's voice was calm but resolute. "I had nothing to do with that company. My father's business dealings were separate from whatever happened. But Hargrove doesn't care about the truth. He just wants someone to blame." Perez gestured to another screen, this one showing a series of emails retrieved from the captain's account. "There's more. He's been in contact with a journalist who specializes in uncovering high-profile scandals. From what we can tell, he planned to leak fabricated information about you and your family." Barron exhaled, his expression unreadable. "So this whole thing was about making a spectacle." "It appears so," Perez replied. But he didn't anticipate how far it would spiral. Based on his behavior, he's not thinking clearly. That makes him unpredictable and dangerous. The intercom in the security office crackled to life, cutting through the silence. "Perez, we've got a situation," a voice said urgently. "The captain's on the intercom again. He's addressing the passengers." Perez's eyes widened, and he turned to the console, switching to the ship's public announcement system. Hargrove's voice came through, sharp and filled with anger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone dripping with bitterness. "You've all been enjoying a lovely cruise, haven't you? But how many of you know the truth about who you're sharing this voyage with? The privileged son of a corrupt dynasty, walking among us as if he's one of us. Barron Trump and his family have taken everything from people like me, and they continue to get away with it." Gasps and murmurs echoed through the security office as Perez quickly muted the broadcast. "He's escalating," Perez said, his voice clipped. "We need to stop this now." Isabel looked at Barron, her worry evident. "You can't let him control the narrative. If you stay quiet, he's going to keep spinning this story until everyone believes it." Barron nodded slowly, his expression hardening. "You're right. I need to confront him, but on my terms." Perez hesitated. Confronting him could be risky. He's volatile, and there's no telling how he'll react. "I'm not afraid of him," Barron said firmly. "But I won't let him keep turning this into a spectacle. I need to face him and put an end to this." Perez sighed, but eventually nodded. "We'll back you up, but be careful. This isn't just about you anymore. He's dragging everyone on this ship into his vendetta." As Perez and his team worked to locate the captain, Barron took a moment to steady himself. Isabel stood by his side, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do," Barron replied, his tone calm but determined. "This is my fight, but I'll make sure it doesn't hurt anyone else." Minutes later, Perez's team located Hargrove in the ship's control room. Barron followed the officers to the narrow corridor outside, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he would say, but one thing was clear: this needed to end. But as Barron approached the control room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove's anger was only part of a much larger, more dangerous truth waiting to be uncovered. The control room of the Elysian Voyager was a stark contrast to the ship's glittering elegance. Functional and utilitarian, it buzzed with the low hum of machinery and the faint murmur of radio chatter. Captain Hargrove stood at the helm, his hands gripping the edge of the control panel with white-knuckled intensity. His uniform, though neatly pressed, could not mask the disheveled, erratic energy emanating from him. Barron entered the room flanked by Perez and two senior officers. Isabel had wanted to come, but Barron insisted she stay behind. This confrontation wasn't something she needed to witness firsthand. His calm exterior belied the storm of emotions swirling within him. Anger, frustration, but also a strange resolve to understand the man who had turned his vacation into a nightmare. Hargrove turned as the door clicked shut, his piercing blue eyes narrowing when he saw Barron. "So, you decided to show up," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm here because I want this to end," Barron replied evenly, stepping forward. "This has gone too far, Captain. Whatever you think you're proving, it's only hurting yourself and everyone else on this ship." Hargrove laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think I care about what happens to me? This isn't about me, kid. It's about justice. Your family has taken everything from people like me. You represent everything that's wrong with this world." Barron's brow furrowed. "You keep saying my family has taken everything. Tell me what that means. What happened to you?" The room fell silent for a moment, save for the faint sound of waves crashing against the hull. Hargrove's gaze hardened, but his voice faltered as he spoke. "You wouldn't understand. People like you never do. My brother was on the sea horizon. He was part of the crew. When that ship went down because of cost-cutting and greed, he went down with it." Barron's eyes softened. He remembered the Sea Horizon tragedy, a shipwreck that had made headlines for months, its aftermath steeped in controversy over safety violations. His father's company had been mentioned in early reports, though the accusations were later debunked. Still, the damage had been done in the public eye. "I'm sorry for your loss," Barron said sincerely. "But my family wasn't involved in what happened. I understand why you're angry, but your blame is misplaced." "Misplaced?" Hargrove snapped, his voice rising. "Your father's company was part of the same web of corruption that allowed that ship to sail. He may not have signed the papers, but he knew. People like him always know." Barron took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Even if that were true, you're punishing the wrong person. I didn't make those decisions. I wasn't even old enough to understand them. Whatever my father did or didn't do doesn't define me. You're letting your anger destroy your judgment." Hargrove's grip on the control panel tightened, his body trembling with barely restrained emotion. "You don't get it, do you? People like me don't have the luxury of walking away from our pain. We carry it every day while people like you move on without a second thought." "I do get it," Barron said, his voice steady but tinged with empathy. "I know what it's like to live under the weight of someone else's actions. I know what it's like to be judged for things you didn't do. But that weight doesn't have to consume you." The room grew still, the tension palpable as Hargrove seemed to wrestle with Barron's words. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, the anger that had burned so fiercely now mingling with something else, grief. Perez stepped forward cautiously. "Captain, it's over. Let us help you." Hargrove's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as he leaned against the console. I wanted someone to see," he murmured, "to understand what it's like." "I see it," Barron said softly. "And I know it's not fair. But this isn't the way to make things right. Let the crew handle this. Let them help you. Hargrove nodded faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The officers moved in carefully, placing a hand on his arm as they led him away. He didn't resist. As the door closed behind them, Barron exhaled deeply, his composure finally cracking as the weight of the confrontation settled on him. He leaned against the console, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. Minutes later, Isabel burst into the room, her face etched with worry. "Are you okay?" she asked, rushing to his side. "I'm fine," Barron said, his voice quiet. "It's over." She placed a hand on his cheek, her eyes searching his. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that. None of this was your fault." "I know," Barron replied, his tone resolute. "But if I didn't confront him, he might have hurt someone else. At least now he'll get the help he needs." The ship's crew worked quickly to restore order, and by the time the Elysian Voyager docked, the incident had already made headlines. Journalists scrambled for details, eager to paint the story as another scandal tied to the Trump name. But passengers who had witnessed the events firsthand told a different story, one of composure, compassion, and courage in the face of chaos. As Barron and Isabel disembarked, a passenger approached them, a middle-aged man who had watched the ballroom confrontation unfold. "I just wanted to say, you handled yourself with class back there," the man said. "Not everyone could have done that." "Thank you," Barron replied, offering a faint smile. As they walked toward the terminal, Isabel slipped her hand into his. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. Barron glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not. People will believe what they want to believe. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how we handle ourselves. That's all we can control." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "And you handled it better than anyone else could have." Barron smiled faintly, the weight of the experience still heavy on his shoulders, but tempered by a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd proven something, not to the world, but to himself. Life isn't about what's thrown at us. It's about how we rise to meet it. In the end, it's not the opinions of others that define us, but the choices we make when no one else is watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge us to think, reflect, and grow.